And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Before we get started, we just need a quick moment to make sure this goes live on Twitter as well. So give us a moment. Yep, Gershon, you should see that you're tagged
Okay.
right now on Twitter. Cool. Hold on. Now you should see it. Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. For those who don't know, Gershon Baskin is a decades-long peace activist. He's the co-head for the Alliance of Two States, and he is a negotiator between Israel and Hamas. Gershon, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I have known each other for years. We actually spoke on this channel a few years ago, but haven't really spoken since. Though I've been following your work, what you post on Twitter, some of the articles you've put out, and you were very big from early on to just accept a ceasefire deal by any means necessary, that defeating Hamas militarily most likely won't succeed, which was my position from pretty much day one. And it seems like now that the dust has begun to settle, you were right. And we lost a lot of life, civilian life, our own hostages, soldiers, just to continue bloodshed for nothing really to show for. Well, what has really the past 2 years been for like you with this battle against Israel and just trying to progress some kind of ceasefire deal?
Well, I, like every other Israeli, suffered greatly during the last 2 years of this war, with feelings of sadness and depression at the massacre that took place on October 7th, and the horrific damages that Israel has done in Gaza. I know hundreds of people in Gaza as well, and I've been in contact with many of them throughout the 2 years. And I also know people have been killed in Gaza. I've been very closely connected to the hostage families. I have negotiated with Hamas on behalf of the families. In fact, in September, the beginning of September 2024, I brought an agreement from Hamas in writing, in Arabic and English, with a voice message confirming that they were agreeing to release all the hostages at that time. I think there were more than 100 hostages at that time, living and deceased, in exchange for ending the war. And the response that I got back from the Israeli side was that Netanyahu wasn't ready to end the war. I was invited to Qatar and I presented it to the Qatari government. I was in contact with the Egyptian intelligence, and they all said that the Americans need to buy into it. And it got to the desk of President Biden. And the answer I got from the Americans, I met with two of the American negotiators who told me that Brett McGurk, who was in charge of the negotiations for Biden, wouldn't even look at it. He was focused on what was presented by Biden in the end of May of 2024, which I immediately called a bad deal. I didn't understand at that point why we were trying to negotiate a partial deal, a partial ceasefire, the return of only some of the hostages, when it was possible to bring them all home. So I have been saying for well over a year that the war could have ended. Israel achieved militarily what it was going to achieve, and everything that will unfold in the coming weeks, hopefully, it's already too late. It's taking too long to get us to phase two. We should have been there already, but it will unfold, and the developments in Gaza could have been done a year ago. We would have saved a lot of lives, hundreds, more thousands in Gaza, probably more than 100 Israeli soldiers, and documented at least 42 of the hostages who've been killed over that year. And it was totally unnecessary. And my heart breaks for everyone on this side who are really victims of the continuation of this conflict.
Right. It's like it's bad enough that our government doesn't care about Palestinian lives, but what we saw the past 2 years is that they don't really care about our lives all too much either.
And
The
it
the
was
idea
very
that
clear that
yeah,
Netanyahu was ready to sacrifice the hostages in order for him to continue the war. And continuing the war had no real strategic goals. It was about staying in power.
right, right. Now, I understand why Israelis were so adamant about Israel's actions in Gaza, because they want to put aside just the anger and revenge that we saw primarily in the weeks after October 7th. But there's
No, I
a
think we saw it throughout the 2 years. The revenge motivation was there throughout the war by the general society, certainly by the army, and definitely by the government. So the revenge motive never left us. It's still there. There are lots of Israelis who don't believe that anyone in Gaza is innocent.
Correct. I would actually, it's the majority based on recent polling. The majority of Jewish Israelis don't think there's innocence in Gaza. And I would go on to say that that data on its own, that's a military that's not fit to serve, not physically fit to serve, but psychologically. If you're operating in a place and you believe there's no innocence there, then that's not the kind of military you should send in for any type of operation.
No, we saw throughout the last 2 years Israeli soldiers committing war crimes on TikTok. I mean, they had the gall to commit war crimes and photograph themselves and be proud of it. And we never had a situation where the Israeli army lacked the kind of discipline that prevented those actions from taking place. And it's not just the common soldiers. You had officers doing this. You had scenes of Israelis responsible for blowing up tunnels or buildings who would, push the button and see these buildings go up to the sky and rejoicing in celebration of destroying the lives of people in Gaza without any regard to the people who are living there.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point about a lot of the war crimes, not the most horrific ones, but a lot of the war crimes we saw because they were uploaded by Israelis, which speaks to really two things: just the general lack of discipline in the IDF. And those who have served know that there's a lack of discipline, but that was very much on display. And the second is simply that they know there won't be backlash, not societal backlash, nor military backlash. So really,
judicial backlash. No one will be brought to justice. No one will be penalized. Everyone has impunity for whatever they did in Gaza. And everyone knows that Israel is being accused of acts of genocide. And it should be clear when they say that, we're not talking about the Holocaust. Israel did not commit the Holocaust in Gaza, but there's a legal definition of what genocide is. It's in the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. This is an international legal document that was written by many Jews after World War II, who were part of drafting the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. And if you read how genocide is described there, what we did in Gaza fits the definition. We have made Gaza unlivable. We have destroyed a civilization. We have destroyed infrastructure, roads, electricity, water, sewage, schools, universities, public buildings, and more than 80% of Gazans are homeless, living in tents in this tragic weather that we've been having, that we, sit in the comfort of our homes. I have a heater on next to me. You see these Gazans who have been flooded, living in tents, all their belongings floating in water. I mean, this is a tragic reality that Israel has direct responsibility for. Now, I'm not forgetting for a moment what they did on October 7th. But what we did in Gaza was 2 years after October 7th.
The magnitude is just incomparable. We kind of have this thing in Israeli society and just in pro-Israel circles in general. They think they could hide behind this concept of intentionality. We're still better than them because we didn't intend to kill civilians, but we killed 20,000 children knowingly. We knew we would kill them, and we decided to. So knowingly killing somebody when it's preventable is not all too different from intentionality, but that's like kind of our saving grace. It's the only thing we can keep telling ourselves to feel like we're morally superior than them. But again,
what most Israelis don't understand also is that since the end of the war, Israel has killed almost 400 people in Gaza, and the majority of them are non-combatants, with a large number of women and children amongst those 400 that we've killed since the war ended.
Right. And it shows, because when a soldier was killed, we have nonstop coverage how they violated the ceasefire, and we need to continue fighting them. But when 400 primarily civilians are killed, it's not even news. I mean, right. It's been, I can understand populations that are in conflict with one another. We just become radicalized to the point of becoming genocidal. That's what happened. We October 7th made our population genocidal. We started seeing signs of it prior, but that was really the tipping point. And I think I don't say this to excuse it, but I want us to just understand human nature. I think populations have capacity to reach that point once they feel like there's enough danger, their back is up against the wall. It's sad to see our people go through this and become so out of touch with reality. But what is even more sad, because it shows a deep institutional and systemic failure, it's that the West allowed this to happen. I believe Gaza to be one of the greatest moral failures of our time because of how easily preventable it was. It's not always easy to prevent mass violence. Sometimes you need to sacrifice more lives just to prevent saving lives, just to save lives. That was not a question here. It would not require military intervention or boots on the ground to stop Israel. It was as simple as the US and Western powers stopping it from happening. And that was troubling because it shows our system, the system that we like to think it adheres to human rights and international law, just enabled one of the greatest atrocities of this century.
Now, there are two things I want to say. Is one, it's very clear that Biden could have ended the war at any point during the war. Right. The United States had the only ability to end the war. And this was true of Trump. And I said it from before Trump entered the White House after the elections, that Trump is the only person who can end the war. And that's essentially what happened. It's why my whole involvement, which we can talk about, was vis-a-vis the Americans, and not, since Trump entered the White House, I didn't even talk to any of the Israeli negotiators. My talks were entirely with the American side. But the second thing that I wanted to say is that we can't escape responsibility by putting the onus on the international community. Israel had to respond to October 7th and had to respond swiftly and with a lot of force, because Israel lost all of its deterrence on October 7th. Well, I don't believe we ever had deterrence vis-a-vis Hamas, because you can't deter someone who believes it's a commandment, a religious commandment, to die. But we had deterrence in the region, particularly vis-a-vis Iran and Hezbollah. And Israel had to respond swiftly and with a lot of force, because on October 7th, we didn't defend our border. We were absent. And that put Israel in a very dangerous position. But it should have been quick. It should have been over after a week or 2 weeks, and then we should have addressed the region and the international community. What happened on October 7th created a reality in the region and in the world that no one wanted to see Hamas anymore in power. And Hamas could have been dealt with politically, internally within the Arab world, within the Palestinian community. It could have been done without the need to destroy all of Gaza and kill what is probably going to be more than 100,000 people killed in Gaza once the rubble is uplifted and we find, or they find, all the missing. There are about 10,000 at least.
Plus indirect deaths, malnutrition, lack of access to medicine, that hasn't even been counted yet. So.
No, and that will add up. I mean, there have been deaths of infants because of the cold and the wet winter we're facing. There'll be more of that. There'll be disease. There's no sewage treatment in Gaza. It's flowing into the streets. People have their tents pitched next to garbage heaps. This is going to breed disease, and it's really terrible. And the problem of Gaza has always been a political problem, not a military problem. In fact, there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is a political solution, but we've escaped for years, both by Palestinians believing that they had a viable armed struggle, that they would free Palestine by killing Israelis, and we on the Israeli side have believed that there's a military solution to this conflict. And it's never been true, not for the Palestinians and not for us. There is only a political solution to this conflict.
Yeah, the way I try to assess what Israel's action should be, when I see the likelihood of defeating Hamas militarily being so low and the cost of trying is immensely high, it just makes sense to first look at all other options before engaging in a process of mass death and destruction. This is actually one of the areas that I'm most debating fellow Israelis or pro-Israelis, that there is another way to deal with Hamas. They say, nope, they're only forced. That's the only way. Clearly, that's not working. So I kind of want to go deeper into this, how you think Hamas can be dealt with. Do you think it's through political pressure, we get them to step down, or through, like we have with many other historical cases of violent resistance groups, that it's possible to get them to make concessions, given concessions on our side in some peace agreement?
They made the concessions already because they understand the reality better than we do. They have no support in Gaza anymore. They have no political leadership anymore. They have almost no military leadership anymore. They can fill a vacuum that's been created because the war ended 2 months ago and there should have been an alternative government in Gaza in place already. This has been the failure of Israel from day one of the war, is that the Israeli side, the politicians, the prime minister, refused to present the alternative to Hamas. And people need government, some form of government. You need some kind of law and order to exist on the streets of Gaza, particularly now when there's total chaos, when there's a breakdown of everything, where there are no public institutions, when there are no schools. People are now sending kids to tents for schools on a volunteer basis run by civil society because Israel destroyed almost every school in Gaza. So you need to have an alternative, a better alternative to the existing reality if you want to make the change. Believe me, I know from talking to the leadership of civil society in the private sector in Gaza over the last months, there is no support for Hamas anymore in Gaza. And that's the best thing that we have going for us. There's no support for Hamas even in Qatar. The Qataris understand that Hamas cannot continue to rule and govern Gaza anymore. And that's the body that was supporting them more than anyone else. So we needed to exploit that. We need to exploit that now. Everything's in the hands of the Americans. And unfortunately, Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been very, very busy with Russia and Ukraine and haven't had all the time and energy to devote to what needs to be done in Gaza. They're picking up the pieces now and trying to move forward with the summit that was just held in Doha, trying to form the International Stabilization Force. Tomorrow, a meeting's taking place in Miami with the three mediators, Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, trying to move us forward into stage two. The Israelis don't want to move to stage two, and they're using the excuse that there's still one remaining deceased hostage, Ron Gvili, whose body hasn't been found yet. The weather conditions make it more difficult to find him, to even engage in the search. But they're searching, and they will continue to search, and hopefully they will find him. But if they don't find him, that's not a reason for us not to move to phase two. We have to move to phase two, which is the International Stabilization Force, the Palestinian Technocratic Government, the Oversight Committee of the Executive Board, and the Board of Peace that Trump is formulating. All these things still need to move forward, and they're going to be relying on American pressure to push Israel back. Israel has to further withdraw from Gaza. You can't have a situation where Gaza is going to be occupied by Israel. That's not acceptable. And we can't even talk about disarming Hamas if Israel is going to remain in Gaza. At the end, Israel is going to have to withdraw totally from Gaza.
But how do you see Hamas actually relinquishing power? What would cause them to do so? Because it seemed quite
agreed to. First of all, they agreed to. They agreed to for more than a year. They know that they can no longer govern Gaza. As I said, in this vacuum, this void that's existed for 2 months, they've taken to the streets. They've recruited more people. But these are not ideological Hamas people. They give people a couple of $100 and a gun.
They need money, yeah.
And sometimes a uniform, lots of times even without a uniform, because there needs to be some way of dealing with the chaos of delivering aid to people. And they're not all evil people. They're actually people who want to serve the interest of the people in Gaza who have nothing. They have no homes, they have no jobs, they have no economy, they have no food, they have no fresh water. Really, Gaza was destroyed. So Hamas is filling that void. Had the Americans acted quicker and made the decisions on the International Stabilization Force and the Executive Committee and the Technocratic Government, they could have done this more than a month ago. We wouldn't see Hamas reemerging on the streets as the controlling power. Also, Israel has violated the ceasefire every single day. And it was even reported in today's Haaretz that Israel keeps moving the line, the yellow line, which is an invisible line. People don't know where it is, but they have noticed in Gaza that Israel is taking more land inside of Gaza as the days go by of moving the line arbitrarily, which creates the continued shooting by Israeli soldiers of Palestinians who cross over that line that they don't know where it is.
Right, and we actually saw 2 weeks ago, the IDF Twitter reported that 2 suspects crossed the line and were shot, and then we saw that it was in Lebanon. Right.
Yeah.
It shows how out of touch with reality our institutions and people have become, that they would even report on that as if these are legitimate suspects. So when you say they agreed to step down from power, you mean, unless I missed some of the details, but from what I understand, they agreed to step down from political power, but they still want to maintain military control.
Look, they said, and this is in the agreement, that they would transfer all power, including security responsibilities, to the new technocratic government, which will establish a Palestinian police force. In the discussions that took place in the negotiations on the decommissioning of weapons or the disarming of Hamas, first of all, the Americans only spoke to them about what's called the offensive weapons, not every single gun that Hamas fighters are holding, but they have agreed, at least until now, they have agreed to freeze the weapons, and the modalities of that have not been defined. What they have said is that they won't give their weapons over to the internationals, or certainly not to the Israelis. They would work out some kind of deal with the new Palestinian government, the new Palestinian police force. This needs to be worked on. It's not going to happen overnight. The Israelis are saying that they won't agree to move into phase 2 until Hamas is disarmed. That's not going to happen. It will take time to take all the weapons from Hamas, to get them to be active players and understanding that they can no longer hold on to their weapons and have that kind of control. It's only on the Israeli side that we hear people talking about a Lebanon model where there's a Lebanese government and a Lebanese army, but Hamas, the Hezbollah is really in charge. Hamas isn't talking about that. Hamas, behind the scenes, really knows that they're finished in terms of the Maqawma, in terms of the resistance, the armed resistance. That's not going to go down anymore in Gaza, and it's the Gazans who don't want to see it anymore. And let's face it, these Hamas assholes who sit in Qatar and in Istanbul and Cairo, who are out of touch with the reality of Gaza and speak on behalf of Hamas, have no real control in Gaza anymore.
So you're hopeful that, okay. And to me,
a lot depends on the continued determination of the Americans and the kind of leverage that they have over Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, who have leverage over Hamas, because Hamas has to understand the reality. Something that they understood immediately when they went into the deal to end the war, and unfortunately the last 2 months have been very bad in terms of keeping that message on target, that they have finished their role in this part of the Palestinian struggle.
Did they say that? Was that something they explicitly
said? They understand
said?
it. Look, the agreement to end the war was, in fact, a kind of surrender, although they would never meet surrender. Khalil Chaya, at the end of when the agreement was signed and the war was declared over, Khalil Chaya, the official head of Hamas today, went on a big telegram, I think it was, and declared victory. You know, it was laughable, because ask anyone in Gaza if Hamas won this war, and people will say, are you crazy? Are you nuts? Hamas won the war? How can they talk about victory? There's no victory here.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because obviously if you're a Gazan, there's no world in which you could believe that Hamas won. In terms of changing global public sentiment against Israel, they were very successful in doing that.
I don't know about that. I mean, that's certainly the Israeli narrative, the Jewish establishment narrative. Everything is anti-Semitism, and people are killed because they're Jews. And here I'm treading on very fragile land, because I wrote a piece the other day stating this. I got a lot of pushback. But what I'm saying is that anti-Semitism in the world is certainly on the rise. But a lot of it is not the old classic anti-Semitism. A lot of it, in fact, is anti-Israelism or anti-Zionism, or responses to what Israel did, and Jews around the world are paying the price for that. There is anti-Semitism, and some of the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but a lot of the criticism of Israel is legitimate. That doesn't warrant killing Jews or having an excuse to kill Jews anywhere. Anti-Semitism is illegitimate all the time, and there's no legitimacy for using violence for political purposes. That's terrorism, and that's what we're seeing around the world. But Jews are suffering not just because they're Jews, but because they're associated with Israel.
Yeah, I think it's abundantly clear that when the Jewish state, in the name of protecting Jews, is mass killing civilians, and people are seeing videos of dead children every day, and this is being either supported or a blind eye being turned by the majority of the world's Jewish population, obviously that's going to impact how people feel about Jews. And I tell my fellow Jews, after 9/11, did Islamophobia not increase? It very clearly did. That's how people responded. That doesn't mean hate or violence is justified towards civilians, but this is very clearly a reaction to Israel's actions and wide-scale support in the Jewish community for Israel's actions. The point I made about Hamas winning, and I would rather anybody who pursues a path of unnecessary violence to not have any victory, because I don't want to reinforce that as a good strategy. For example, if Hamas does step down, many Israelis will say, "You see, the force worked." And I think Hamas and some of their supporters are doing something similar, because public opinion has really, especially in the younger generation, is way more pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. And it's very likely that the surest way to solve the conflict is not from some internal grassroots movement, but it's actually pressure from the US. So to actually get the younger generation, to reinvigorate them and get them to care about the Palestinian cause, that is a major victory, right?
I've said to pro-Palestine groups abroad, and I've said this together with Palestinians, that your message of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is an anti-Palestinian message, because ignoring the reality of the existence of Israel is never going to free Palestine. The slogan needs to be "from the river to the sea, in 2 states, on 2 states we agree," or something like that. Then you're talking about a solution where Palestinians can actually claim victory in their struggle for freedom and liberation. And the bottom line message that I give constantly is that Israel will never have security if Palestinians don't have freedom, and Palestinians will never have freedom if Israel doesn't have security. There is a linkage between Israel's security and Palestinians' freedom. And this is the kind of message that we need people to understand. The Palestinians have no viable armed struggle. Even when people challenge me that according to international law, they have the right to engage in an armed struggle against the Israeli occupation, I say, fine. You have that right to engage against the military occupation of Palestine with the use of arms, but you have no viable struggle. You are not going to achieve your freedom by killing Israelis, period. And if there's one lesson that needs to be learned from Gaza, it's that. I was in Ramallah a few weeks ago. I did a television show at the El Arabiya, the Saudi television station, at their studio in Ramallah. And at the end of the interview, we went up to the roof, and I'm looking out at Ramallah, and it was so quiet and calm. And we're discussing with the guys from El Arabiya, why hasn't the West Bank erupted in violence? Because the situation is horrible. It's horrific. The economy has crashed. 130 new settlements since the beginning of the war. More than 1,000 Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the beginning of the war. Thousands of olive trees uprooted and cut down, and so much more land being taken, not only in Area C, but in Area B in the Palestinian villages now. And yet the West Bank is overall very calm. And the reason is because they're looking at Gaza. And every Palestinian who lives in Ramallah or Hebron or Tulkarem or Nablus or Jenin says, do I want my home to turn into Gaza? And the answer is no. So in this way, there is a kind of Israeli deterrence that's been created by what Israel did in Gaza. On the other hand, this is not a viable strategy, not for Israel to have security and not for the Palestinians to have freedom and liberation.
And you bring up a very good point when people say, they talk about the right to violent resistance, but a more important question is not simply do you have the right to violence, is it an effective strategy? And I think that's what needs to be proven before engaging in violence. And this needs to be universal. So one side will say Palestinians have a right to resist. Israel has the right to self-defense. True. That doesn't mean they have a right to do October 7th. It doesn't mean we have a right to self-defense in the way we defended ourselves.
That's right.
Violence needs to be justified, and we need to prove that there's no alternative option. And we clearly see that there seems to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, it's really, if 10 years ago we talked about, or when Shimon Peres talked about a new Middle East and Israel integrating into the Middle East, people in Israel looked around and said, do we want to be part of this Middle East? And the answer was no. But when you look at the Middle East today, it's a very different Middle East. When you look at the Emirates, you look even a place like Qatar, anyone who's been to Doha is just amazed by what you see there. Saudi Arabia, what's happening in Saudi Arabia, the changing of this region is very inviting to Israelis. The Abraham Accords, think about the Abraham Accords when the entire international community shut down its airlines to Israel. And only the 3 Israeli airlines were working. Every day there were 15, 16, 17 flights of Air Dubai, of Emirates, of Etihad, of the Emirati airlines that were flying every single day during the 2 years of war. This is the part of the region that really, really want to be part of. Where if we were to join the entire region in peace with a Palestinian state next to Israel, it's no longer Israel, the villa in the jungle. It's Israel, a welcome partner in a very interesting and developing neighborhood that we should want to be part of.
Right. And, it's interesting how what you just described is very much counter to the narrative we hear that, we are a small island in a sea of enemies. But when we look around, we actually have normalization or cold peace with most of our immediate neighbors and an interest from others. All roads lead back to Palestine, right? If we solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, then peace will fall into place with most other countries.
But even before there's full peace with Palestine, there are new dynamics that are happening in Syria and in Lebanon, which could lead to security agreements that could eventually lead to full normalization and peace agreements, depending upon what happens with the Palestinians. But there are emerging interests in the region that have developed out as a result of the war. There's no doubt that the collapse of the Assad regime was a side effect of the war that took place. The weakening of Hezbollah was a result of the war that took place. There were military achievements in the region that are substantial and need to be turned into political victories for us all, for the Syrians, for the Lebanese, and for the Israelis. And of course, eventually for the Palestinians as well.
Yeah, and I was going to also just add, we saw that when Iran was shooting missiles, they were being shot down by all our neighbors.
That's
Jordan,
right.
We actually currently have security cooperation, even with Saudi Arabia. It's a quiet cooperation, but it exists.
There's no doubt. There was a non-negotiated mutual defense pact, which was demonstrated twice when the Iranians shot missiles at Israel.
Let's see. We do have some people that want to ask questions, so we'll bring them on in a few moments. So friends here on Discord, raise your hand if you want to hop on, or you could submit a question via text. And I think I have 1 or 2 more questions before you. And those here on YouTube, feel free to submit via YouTube. So I recall last time we spoke a few years ago, you were still supportive of 2 states, but you were honest about the fact that you don't know how feasible it is with settlement expansion and just the 1-state reality we currently live in. Years have passed, and it's not that the situation has really improved in that regard. It's gotten worse, if anything. Do you still have hope?
The situation on the ground has gotten worse, but politically, in terms of support for 2-state solution, we've never been in a better place. There are more countries around the world today who recognize the state of Palestine. I saw on Facebook, I think today, the Palestinian ambassador in London received official notice that the government of the United Kingdom has formally declared that the Palestinian representative office in London is now the embassy of the state of Palestine in London, and the person who filled the task as representative of the Palestinian Authority, of the PLO in London, is now the ambassador of the state of Palestine. The UN Security Council resolution that passed with the Trump 20 points attached to it has documented, with the assertiveness of the United States, point number 19 that this process will lead to Palestinian self-determination and Palestinian statehood. This is something that the Israelis pushed back really hard on, and Trump would not agree to remove it from the text. So there's never been a better chance. What we have is a reality where a majority of Israelis and a majority of Palestinians declare that they really want to live in peace, but they don't believe that there's a partner for peace on the other side. This is the dynamic that we need to change here in Israel and in Palestine to make this a reality. There's no question that it'll be difficult to make decisions, but there are solutions for every issue, including settlements, including Jerusalem, including the right of return and refugee issues. Every single solution, they've been negotiated for so many years, and we know what the options are, that this could be done. What we need to do is change our government in Israel, and the Palestinians need to go to elections and choose a new leadership that will lead them, hopefully, in the direction of making peace with Israel on the basis of two states. There is no other solution to the conflict. As much as people want to dream about some utopian reality of the United States of Israel and Palestine, where Israel and Palestine are not national ethnic states representing the identities of their people who live on the land of Israel and the land of Palestine. I mean, what is it this war has been about for the last 100 years? It's been about a territorial expression of identity. We've been, both sides, willing to fight, to die, and to kill in order to say that this piece of land that we're living on belongs to me. It's mine. I give my identity to it, and I take my identity from it. So people who have dreamed of the non-ethnic, non-national, non-religious state of Israel and Palestine are simply presenting a solution that doesn't solve the problem, because the problem is territory and identity. And by erasing the identity from the territory, you're not solving the question of what it is that we've been fighting for.
And just to add one point, there is the recent polling data that the majority of Palestinians living between the river and the sea currently support two states. It's at nearly an all-time high. Maybe Oslo was higher, but it seems like we're below 50%, right? So our narrative
we're slightly above 50%, but the polling data doesn't really make the difference. What makes the difference is the leadership. We need leaders on both sides who are going to come out and say, we need Palestinian leaders who are going to say, we recognize the Jewish connection, the historic and religious connection to the land of Israel. And as my friend Samer says, we want to remind the Jews that while we recognize your religious and historic connection to the land of Israel, we want to remind you that you were never here alone. There are always others, and we're the others. And we need to hear Israeli leaders say to the Palestinian people that we recognize your peoplehood, we recognize your historic and religious connection to the land of Palestine. We need this mutual recognition of identity to the territory, and that has to come from leaders.
And you mentioned your friend Summer. That's Summer Sinjawali?
Yeah, Sinjalawi.
Okay, cool. Great guy. Yeah, I had him on for a stream a few months back.
He's my closest Palestinian partner that we work together. We're the co-heads of this alliance for two states that we've created.
Okay, cool. I was actually recently in Hamburg with him for one of the Minds of Peace negotiations. So it was cool, and he represented two states there. So
yeah, Samer said something, I think, at that meeting or another meeting they had in Geneva. Samer and I are finished with these closed-door Chatham House rule meetings of Israelis and Palestinians. No, we have no space for having meetings of Israelis and Palestinians who are ghosts, sitting behind closed doors that no one knows about. We need Israelis and Palestinians who are going to have the courage to stand up together, to meet in public. We did a meeting last month outside of Jericho with 100 Israelis and Palestinians. There was a public meeting. We invited journalists to come. We informed everyone in advance that this is an open door meeting. We're not running away and hiding from the reality that we're talking to each other and we're talking about peace with each other. And this has to be our message. No more of these closed door meetings between Israelis and Palestinians. We don't need to travel to Hamburg and to Geneva and to Paris to hold these meetings where we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to make them happen. We need to meet here. We need to meet in Israel and in Palestine and create the opportunities. And where it can't be done physically, so we have Zoom, we have different platforms that we can do it. But there are even places where we can meet together. And eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to meet once again with Gazans face to face.
Inshallah. We actually did a meetup in Jericho last week, an Israeli-Palestinian meetup, and we had 20 Gazans call in through Zoom.
Yeah, we had Gazans at our Jericho meeting also on Zoom.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And hopefully soon the border does open and we could see them in person. Yeah. With that, we're going to bring on Shadow Disc. Shadow, floor is yours.
Hello, Mr. Baskin. Thank you for everything you do. I am in awe of both you and Summer. Working on really hard problems is as noble as it is often thankless. That being said, with your permission, I'd like to take 5 minutes, a real full 5 minutes, to explain why I believe a two-state or any other just solution is too difficult to achieve, and then have you educate us on why I'm wrong and why you have hope. Is that okay?
I don't know. It's up to Adar if you have 5 minutes or not, but
Yeah, I already gave him the green light on that, so I'll
go for it.
Thank you. So my alternative proposal would be to simply unilaterally recognize that the conflict will not be solved, and that to avoid a Bantustan or Emirates model, we should simply with clear eyes understand that ultimately Palestinians will have Gaza, areas A and B, some small fraction of area C, and work every year to create small exchanges of security for autonomy, inching closer towards a more stable environment where economic incentives outweigh sectarian violence. I share your belief that Israelis and Palestinians recognize that they are unlikely to cause the other to disappear. But for any political settlement to be stable, it needs to be either mutually understood as just or collectively accepted as never up for renegotiation if the balance of power ever changes. Absent these conditions, the stronger side will continue to keep the weaker side as weak as possible, which is the current stable equilibrium we are in. I know that you think there are solutions for all of the problems, and I agree there are solutions, but the expectation is that with full sovereignty, the Palestinian polity will eventually renegotiate towards whatever they see is justice. And on that expectation, Israel will prevent them from ever having sovereignty. I'll summarize first why a two-state solution on 67 borders is perceived as unjust, and then why we are impossibly far away from both sides recognizing it as a practical compromise. Israelis are convinced by history, by the pogroms in Europe, by the Holocaust, by the dhimmi status in the Middle East, by the Hebron massacre, in which non-Zionist Jews were attacked due to a conspiracy theory by the Palestinian leader at the time that the Jews planned to destroy Alaska, by the expulsion of non-Zionist Jews from Iraq and Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, that unless they have political control, they will eventually become unsafe. They will trigger nuclear war or flee Israel before they agree to a one-state solution. On the other hand, Palestinians reject that anything about the Jews can possibly legitimize Jewish supremacy or invalidate the individual right of return to all of Palestine, both of which is incompatible with the state anywhere in Palestine dedicated towards Jewish political supremacy and control, either explicitly or as an engineered side effect of demographic supermajority. Inconveniently, both groups have strong cultural defenses against bridging these two theories of justice. I've tried really hard to prove otherwise. Palestinians, when I talk to them, generally reject claims that there is a Jewish temple under Alaska, that Jews are uniquely unsafe as a minority, or that the Holocaust justifies anything. And even if it did, that claim was voided by the theft of their land and the genocide in Gaza. On the other hand, Israelis see the Palestinians and their Arab allies as having started pointless wars and terror campaigns, and have as a result lost any claims to basically anything that could possibly threaten Israeli security, such as sovereignty. Now, the issue of a practical, lasting compromise, first in theory, then in practice. There's no social mechanism by which Israelis or Palestinians can credibly commit across generations to anything indefinitely, and a history of not responsibly doing so. Muslim culture has the concept of hudna, which is that if you're too weak right now, you can have a ceasefire for many years, but there's no mechanism to bind your descendants to an unjust solution. And in practice, Hamas and Arab armies have been perfectly willing to feign being deterred, only to attack on Jewish holidays when they have the advantage of surprise. Similarly, Israel does not have a culture of respecting international law or Middle Eastern norms. They bomb Hamas negotiators in Qatar, even though they were guests invited to negotiate in safety. They nibble away at Syrian and Lebanese borders precisely in line with their strategic incentives, and so forth. Since in theory there's no compatibility between their theories of justice and there's no formal mechanism to accept and tolerate injustice, the only hope I might have had is some kind of spontaneous compromise through exhaustion or extreme political pressure. But here too, I fear we are not even close. I'm almost done. Israeli primary practical concern is security, yet in real terms, the spectacular success against Iran and Hezbollah and the knock-on impact on Syria, combined with the newly emerged broader Arab consensus that a Palestinian state would be demilitarized, has reduced the risk of a two-state solution by close to 80%. And yet, this has had no observable impact on Israeli polity's willingness to risk allowing Palestinian sovereignty. Nothing we could possibly organize around could have close to the same benefit to Israeli security in real terms the last 2 years of war have achieved. And also nothing the armies of Hamas or their allies could muster through military or international pressure, given the new Israeli strategic posture of proactively dismantling emerging threats and the power of global capital to prioritize economic and political stability over moral justice, is likely to generate enough leverage to outweigh the security risk of Palestinian sovereignty. And Palestinian primary practical concern is autonomy. Yet in real terms, their autonomy has steadily eroded over the last 2 decades. The settler project has created facts on the grounds you are very well aware of, where they have lost contiguity across areas A and B. They have lost control over significant chunks of Jerusalem and Area C. And yet there is not a collective demand for a surrender to halt this progression. The October 7th attack, despite predictably causing the flattening of Gaza, has not triggered, as we might hope, a total recalibration of either expectations for what is realistic as a final settlement, or military methods to achieve that goal that in practice is useful up to a very small point, and then deeply counterproductive if demands rise above that threshold. A fully sovereign state on 67 borders, or a one-state solution with the reversing of Zionism, remains the minimally acceptable final demand of any Palestinian I have spoken with. To conclude, in history books, societies ravaged by trauma or that fail to destroy each other sometimes change to avoid collapse. And if it takes them 100 years to do so, historians then call it the 100-Year War. But it seems that all of the evidence tells us that we're in year 85 of a war that will last much longer than 85 years. Please explain to me, what am I missing? What is the core, what is the narrative shattering, what is the narrative shattering facts that I'm missing? Why do you have hope in a different vision?
First of all, thank you for that. I could agree with everything that you said and add that it's all irrelevant and it doesn't make any difference. One is because the assessments of the experts, including myself, are usually wrong. It's the unexpected that happens. And perhaps the two best examples of that totally unexpected events that changed everything that was believed to be true was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. If you had said to someone a year before it happened that the Berlin Wall would fall and the Soviet Union would be over, people would say that you're Looney Tunes, that you're completely detached from reality. And the second example is, of course, the end of apartheid and Nelson Mandela. If you had said 2 years before Nelson Mandela was released from prison that 4 years later he would be president of a democratic South Africa, people would have said that you were from a different planet. I would say currently, in September of 2024, when I said that Hamas was willing to release all the hostages, there wasn't a single voice in the world who agreed. They all said, Hamas will never release all the hostages. They're always going to hold hostages as their insurance policy. And they were all wrong. Now, the big difference between everything you said and the reality that we're living in today is one word: Trump. Now, I personally think that Trump is dangerous. I think he's a horrible president for the United States. I think he's dangerous for the world, but he saved us. This war would be going on today if it wasn't for Trump. And Trump believes, as he said even yesterday, that for the first time in 3,000 years, he brought peace to the Middle East Trump believes himself. And Trump is the only person in the world who has the ability to put pressure on Israel. And let's face it, it's Israel that the primary pressure needs to be applied on. It doesn't matter that Palestinians and Israelis might think collectively that a two-state solution is unjust or doesn't provide them with justice or doesn't provide us for an end to the conflict in a way that gives us justice. There is never absolute justice, because the justice of one side is the injustice of the other. We have to seek maximal justice for both sides to perceive that they're getting what they need. Palestinians need to end the occupation. They need to be in control of their own lives. They have accepted throughout negotiations for more than a 20-year period that the Palestinian state will be demilitarized, or in fact, as they argued in negotiations, would be non-militarized, because they have said in negotiations, we were never militarized, we don't need to demilitarize. We will have a non-militarized state. The parameters of what a two-state solution is about are known. The Palestinian state will be established on 22% of historic Palestine. Is that fair? No, it's not fair. But it's also the consequence of making bad decisions. Let's face it, for 100 years, the Palestinians have had three leaders, Haj Amin Husseini, Yasser Arafat, and Mahmoud Abbas, and none of them ever asked the Palestinian people what they thought and wanted. None of them cared about what the Palestinian people thought or wanted, and they continued to do injustice to their own people, including the 20-year service of Mahmoud Abbas, who has gone through different stages, but he has created a dictatorial regime which is corrupt and unaccepted by the Palestinian people, who see him as a subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. There is no full justice here. We're not going to reach that, but there is no other solution to a two-state solution. What you talked about was largely a process that may take a very long period of time. I think that the results of the last 2 years are going to speed up that process enormously. The fact that the end game is known, which was absent throughout the Oslo peace process period of 20 years, the end game is up front now. And once you know where the end game is and you know where you're heading, it's much easier to reach it. The problem with the Oslo peace process, with the 6 agreements that were signed between Israel and the PLO, is that there was no explicit end game ever in sight. It was never there. It was never in writing. It was never part of the agreement. And therefore, each side could think what they wanted it to be. The Israelis didn't want to see a Palestinian state, and the Palestinians thought they were getting a Palestinian state. But that was never explicit. Now the end game is explicit. It's known. We know what the parameters are. We know what it looks like. We know what the map looks like. We know how to deal with settlements. We know that by annexing 4 to 5% of the West Bank in exchange for land swaps from inside of Israel, that more than 80% of the settlers will stay where they are and be found within Israeli sovereignty. There are ways of dealing with the other 20% of the settlers as well. There are solutions for Jerusalem, where the heart of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, won't be under Israeli sovereignty nor Palestinian sovereignty. There are models that have been worked out and developed in plans in detail on how to deal with all the issues of conflict. So we don't have to rely on religious mythology and belief systems that seem hardened within both societies, because those things change. Just remember the impact of the Sadat visit to Jerusalem. 2 months before Sadat visited Jerusalem, 80% of Israelis were against giving up any part of Sinai in exchange for peace. And 2 months after the Sadat visit to Jerusalem, 80% of Israelis were in favor of giving up all of Sinai in exchange for peace with Egypt. Public opinion is fluid. We have, I believe, between 20 to 30% of Israelis and 20 to 30% of Palestinians who will never agree to any kind of agreement between them. This is the hard right, the religious fundamentalist Muslims, the Messianic Jews, who won't agree to any solution. But we have a potential of 70% in both societies, and maybe more than 70%, who would agree to an agreement. For Israelis, they want security. For most Israelis, it's not about ideology, about the greater land of Israel or the biblical borders from the Nile to the Tigris and Euphrates. It's about security. And for Palestinians, it's not really about Haifa, Akko, Ramle, and Lod. It's about having freedom, about having self-determination. And there are agreements in which we recognize that all the land of Israel is important to Israelis and Jews, and all the land of Palestine is important to Palestinians, wherever they are living in Palestine or outside of Palestine, and still come up with solutions that enable people to have free movement and to have dignity and to have security and to have peace.
That was deeply persuasive. and very eloquent. Thank you. One last question. I understand that you're saying that larger forces will basically direct us wherever we're going, and you have a lot of hope in Trump, and I hope you're right. In the meantime, do you have any messages that you would want our community or like-minded communities to try to share? You know, social consensuses you wish were a little bit more firmly rooted, so that
I think the bottom line is what I said, that Israel will never have security if the Palestinians don't have freedom. Palestinians won't have freedom if Israelis don't have security. This is the equation that we need to work on. We need to get away from this belief in a one-state false reality. We need to confront those pro-Palestinian people who are talking about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and to get them to understand that they are working against the interest of the Palestinian people. And we need to say to Jews and to Israelis who say there can never be a Palestinian state, that what they're doing is dooming Israel to live by the sword forever.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Thanks, Shadow. Gershon, how much more time do you have?
I don't know. How much more time do we need? I'm doing an El Arabiya thing on television, Saudi television at 10, but I don't want to stay here until 10.
Yeah. So we'll do one more caller, one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Cool. Yeah. It's going to be a late night for you, so we'll let you get some rest. George, what's up, man? We're bringing you on.
Hey guys, thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just want to make a much shorter statement, about a minute and a half, regarding a one-state solution, and see what you guys quickly think. So Zionism was primarily a way to deal with European anti-Semitism, right? If we wouldn't have had European anti-Semitism, obviously the Jews could have felt safe in Europe, and things would have just gone in a totally different direction. But now European anti-Semitism is just a set of fallacies. It's a set of intellectual errors, confusing Jewish overrepresentation in finance and banking because the Islamic and Christian world made it illegal, or confusing Jewish overrepresentation in the Bolshevik Revolution for other complex factors. These are all fallacies that we can only overcome through reason, logic, and education. Zionism didn't do any of that. It gave into the fallacies, and it said that the solution was to abandon the real synagogues and places where the Jews had really lived for thousands of years, to then move to Palestine and coerce the local population into a made-up Zionist nationalist identity, right? And people were adamantly opposed to having this done on them, especially by a bunch of secular atheists that care little about religion. I'm sure you guys know, Herzl wanted to convert all the Jews into Christianity. David Ben-Gurion was a hardcore socialist. He went to the Soviet Union during the 7th anniversary of the October Revolution to get a glimpse of his Greek hero, Trotsky. So this idea that Zionism was going to overcome anti-Semitism was just a mistake. It never dealt with what really needed to happen, with educating people and overcoming it that way. And since it was a mistake, it only made things worse. And that's what 120 years of Zionism has shown us, right? We've never had more chaos between Jews and non-Jews. Before Zionism, Jews were getting more and more equal rights. Of course, we had the Dreyfus Affair and a couple of things, but if you look at the history, things were getting better for everyone. So I just think that we need to realize that Zionism was an intellectual error, not some conspiracy of evil guys, and what a lot of naive people say. It was just a flawed way to deal with anti-Semitism. That's all. Sometimes lots of smart people do make mistakes, and so again, Zionism attempted to overcome anti-Semitism through vilification, force, and separation, and those are errors that only make things worse. So now we can solve this mess, right? We can realize that anti-Semitism is a set of errors, and the Zionism that grew from it is also a set of errors. We can try to overcome both fallacies, right? And we can realize that we can go back to having one state where everybody has equal rights, and we can think this through a free market mechanism, and we can slowly do it by integrating people slowly. And I believe that it can be done if we have enough people who understand this, but we do have to see these things as intellectual errors, okay? Anti-Semitism is a set of errors, and Zionism, coercing millions of people into a nationalist, flag and all this, that too was a mistake that never dealt with the underlying fallacy. So that's it. That's what I want to say. And one last thing. Remember, in the United States, we had slavery. There was an understanding, incredible hate between blacks and whites. And a lot of people thought that, well, if you're going to get slaves equal rights and they're going to have the right to own guns, they're going to go crazy. They're going to start killing their oppressors. We did it in the United States through recognizing, I mean, we're all equally human. We're all Homo sapiens. So just like we did it in the United States, I have little doubt in my mind that we will be able to do it in Israel and Palestine. So that's it. That's all I want to say. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, George. No, my response to you would be this. In 47 years of conflict resolution work that I've done, the one clearest lesson that I've learned over 47 years is that you can't resolve conflicts by dealing with history. The history of what happened and brought us where we are today is history, and each side will, or every person within the conflict zone will have their own explanation and narrative for what happened and why it happened, and whether it was right or wrong, intellectual failure, or whatever the reason was. The reality that I deal with, and I challenge you that we need to deal with, is that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are 7 million people who call themselves Palestinians and 7 million people who call themselves Israeli Jews. That's the reality. We're given on a piece of territory that both sides claim as their own, and they claim that all of it belongs to them. That's the reality that we have to deal with, and not the historical narrative or the intellectual mistakes that were made or the external factors that led to the creation of Zionism in the state of Israel. There is a reality on the ground here in December of 2025, where there are 14 million people, half of them Israeli Jews, half of them Palestinian Arabs. That's what we have to face. And we have to look forward, not backwards. We need to learn from history. We need to remember history. Certainly none of us are going to give up the narrative of the damage that the other side did to us. We're going to have to deal with reconciliation and truth in the future as well. But we have an objective reality where we have one territory with two people who claim it. And there are two identifiable groups who have a very strong national and religious identity. That's the problem that we face. That's the problem that we have to solve.
Yeah, I agree. We do have to learn from history. There was a time where the Soviets and millions of people really bought into the Soviet Union and hardcore communism, and they got their Gorbachevs. They realized they made a mistake, and they turned it around. And I believe that we can do the same thing in Israel.
I think so too, and I think that the first step is toward the mutual recognition of the connection of both peoples to this land, historically and religiously, that anyone who sees in the long distance a one-state solution has to understand that the road to get there is through a two-state solution, when there are two states living in peace and normalcy and open borders and a mutually beneficial economy. You can talk about lowering the borders and erasing borders in the future, but there is no jumping from the tragedy of that we're living today in the last 2 years to one state reality of any kind. We have a one state reality today whereas there's Jewish supremacy and apartheid and a genocide in Gaza, and that's certainly not the reality that we want.
No, excellent. You just solved the problem, right? Someday in the future, we can have a one state, right?
Maybe.
And we can start talking about that and starting to
maybe we'll have two states that'll be very friendly neighbors, and it'll be like the United States and Canada used to be.
I think the tension here is probably one between an ideal vision for the land and a deeply pragmatic one. And I think, Gershon, you're deeply rooted in pragmatism and what's the most feasible path forward. And I actually see you get a lot of shit from the pro-Palestinian side for this, that like liberal Zionist has become a slur. You're a liberal Zionist. You're just trying to.
I'm not a liberal Zionist. I'm an Israeli. I don't talk about Zionism anymore. Zionism is maybe the movement that brought.
Yeah, that's the accusation.
I don't define myself as a Zionist anymore. And you know what? A lot of these pro-Palestinian people abroad in the diaspora are working against the Palestinian interest. They don't really understand what Palestinian interests are about.
I agree. And George, that wasn't in regards to you. I've known you for some months now, and I know you're on our side. But I do see Gershon, like, despite the disagreements, but I do see you getting hate from some people online, and it's just such a shame that let's call it the radical bloc of the pro-Palestine movement is so loud. I don't know if they're the majority. I don't think they're the majority, but they're certainly present. And
I don't see them. I don't deal with them. I don't interact with them. I don't respond to them.
You just ignore them. Okay.
I do.
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
those people are deeply flawed, right? You know, those Palestinians who say that the Israelis are just a bunch of capitalist exploiters, you know, and they're racist and all that stuff. Those people are making mistakes too. You know, we have a lot of mistakes to overcome. And I just want to conclude by thanking you, Gershon and Adar. I want to encourage everyone to watch your interview with the great Thaddeus Russell that you recently did, and that was really awesome. So, okay,
Sure,
thanks, guys.
yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, George.
So look, you know, I agree with a lot of the Palestinian critics of Israel. I'm living in a state where our government is horrible. Our government committed war crimes, and I think our government creates crimes against the people of Israel every single day. So there's no question that Israel is a horrible place today, and we have a lot to be ashamed of. And Israel has enjoyed impunity for too long, and the people of Israel have been complicit for too long in the continued crimes against the Palestinian people. But that also means that the Palestinian people have to take responsibility for their own failures, the failure of their leadership, and the need for change within Palestine. And Palestinians need to be able to elect their new leaders, and hopefully when they do go to elections, they will elect leaders who are pragmatic and understand that they have to make peace with Israel.
I think that's a great place to end this. I'll end with just one more thing. A few months ago, you were on Piers Morgan on a show, and you were debating some pro-Israel propagandist, and she made just that Hasbara argument we've been hearing for years about how there's no Palestinian people, and you said that argument should be left in the dustbin of history. And I love that line. I started using it, just so you know. So that was a great line.
She was pretty horrible. It was just unbelievable that someone like her actually gets television time.
That's the best they have to offer at this point. You know, that's where we're at.
Yeah.
Awesome, Gershon. So if people want to get in touch with you, reach out, see your work, what's the best way to find you? I'll put all these links here in the description. So
best way is to send me an email, and people I want to engage with can, I'll give them a WhatsApp number because I communicate mostly by WhatsApp these days. But my email is really simple, Gershon Baskin, one word, @gmail.com.
Awesome. And I will link that below and give them a link to your Twitter as well. Gershon, It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And I look forward to us meeting in person at some point at some event. So
sure, definitely. I love Ma'alot. Great place.
Come visit.
Yeah,
I like to say the Western Galilee is the best example of coexistence between the river.
It's that and Haifa. But you know, the roads in Israel are so congested these days that I try to use public transportation